When Kurt Cobain was driving home from a late recording session at London Bridge Studios on a fog-covered November evening in 1993, the last thing he expected was to encounter a scene that would profoundly change his perspective on life, success, and what truly matters. As he navigated the winding roads of West Seattle, his headlights caught sight of an elderly man standing beside a broken-down 1978 Buick, looking helpless and defeated in the cold drizzle that had been falling since sunset. What happened during the next 2 hours would become one of the most meaningful conversations of Kurt's life. Though neither man initially knew who the other was, the elderly stranger's story would shake Kurt to his core and force him to confront questions about his own mortality, legacy, and the fleeting nature of time that had been haunting him for months. But the most remarkable part of their encounter wasn't the tire change itself. It was what the old man shared about his own life during those quiet moments on the side of the road that would give Kurt a new understanding of courage, resilience, and the power of human connection to heal even the deepest wounds. What Kurt learned that night would influence his music, his relationships, and his approach to the final months of his life in ways that no one could have predicted. And what the elderly man discovered about his unexpected Good Samaritan would restore his faith in the kindness of strangers at a time when he needed it most. Kurt had been feeling particularly isolated and depressed during the fall of night. The pressure surrounding the release of In Utero was intensifying, and the constant media speculation about his personal life and struggles with addiction had left him feeling like a prisoner in his own existence. Music, which had always been his sanctuary, was beginning to feel like another source of stress, rather than creative expression. Kurt was in a really dark place during that period, recalled Dave Grohl years later. He felt like everyone was watching him, waiting for him to fail or self-destruct. The joy had gone out of music for him, and that scared all of us who cared about him. The recording session that evening had been particularly frustrating. Kurt had been working on acoustic arrangements for some of the more aggressive songs from In Utero, trying to find new ways to express the emotions behind the dicks. But nothing felt right, and he had eventually given up and decided to head home early. Kurt left the studio around 9 p.m. that night, remembered sound engineer Craig Montgomery. He seemed really discouraged and said he needed some time to clear his head. He looked exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The drive from the studio to Kurt's Capitol Hill home normally took about 25 minutes, but on this particular evening, Kurt had decided to take a longer, more scenic route through West Seattle. He often did this when he needed time to think, finding something calming about the winding roads and glimpses of Puget Sound. Kurt used to say that driving helped him process his thoughts, Courtney recalled. When he was really stressed or overwhelmed, he would take these long drives around Seattle, just trying to work through whatever was bothering him. As Kurt drove through the Lincoln Park area around 9:45 p.m., his attention was caught by the sight of hazard lights blinking weakly through the fog. As he got closer, he could see an Emden man standing beside an old Buick that was obviously disabled, with what appeared to be a flat rear tire. The man looked to be in his 70s, wearing a thin windbreaker that was clearly inadequate for the cold, damp weather. He was standing uncertainly beside his car, occasionally glancing hopefully at the passing vehicles, most of which continued on without stopping. Kurt's first instinct was to keep driving. He was tired, emotionally drained, and not particularly interested in dealing with other people's problems. But something about the old man's posture, defeated, vulnerable, also just resigned to his fate, made Kurt reconsider. "I almost didn't stop," Kurt later confided to a close friend. "I was in such a selfish mindset that night, feeling sorry for myself and my problems. But then I realized that this guy was probably having a much worse evening than I was." Kurt pulled over about 20 feet ahead of the disabled Buick and walked back through the mist to where the elderly man was standing. As he approached, he could see that the man was shivering slightly and looked genuinely relieved to see someone willing to help. "Looks like you're having some car trouble," Kurt said, trying to sound friendly despite his own gloomy mood. "Oh, thank goodness someone stopped," the elderly man replied, his voice carrying a slight tremor that could have been from cold or nervousness. "I'm afraid I'm not very good with this sort of thing anymore." The man introduced himself as Walter Chen, a 72-year-old retired teacher who had been driving home from visiting his wife at a memory care facility in Burien when his tire had gone flat. He explained that he had never been particularly mechanical and felt overwhelmed by the prospect of trying to change the tire himself. "I used to be able to handle these things when I was younger," Walter said with a self-deprecating smile. "But these days, I'm more likely to hurt myself than fix anything. I was hoping someone would come along who knew what they were doing." Kurt immediately offered to change the tire, despite the fact that his own experience with car maintenance was limited. He figured that between the two of them, they could probably manage the task, and it seemed like the right thing to do for someone who was clearly in distress. "Don't worry about it," Kurt told Walter. "We'll get you back on the road. Do you have a spare tire and a jack?" As they worked together to locate the necessary tools in Walter's trunk, the two men began to engage in the kind of casual conversation that often develops between strangers who find themselves in unexpected circumstances together. Walter mentioned that he had been a high school English teacher for 42 years before retiring, and that he had always prided himself on being able to help his students solve problems. Now, he joked, he couldn't even solve his own automotive problems. "It's funny how life changes your perspective on what you can and can't handle," Walter observed as Kurt began loosening the lug nuts on the flat tire. Things that used to seem so simple become these insurmountable challenges. Kurt found himself oddly comforted by Walter's matter-of-fact acceptance of his limitations. There was something refreshing about talking to someone who was honest about their struggles, without being dramatic or self-pitying about them. "I know what you mean," Kurt replied, surprising himself with his willingness to engage in personal conversation with a complete stranger. "Sometimes I feel like I used to understand things that don't make sense to me anymore." As Kurt worked on changing the tire, Walter began to share more details about his current life situation. He explained that his wife of 48 years, Eleanor, had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease 2 years earlier and was now living in a specialized care facility because he could no longer manage her care at home. "Eleanor was always the one who kept our life organized," Walter said with a mixture of fondness and sadness. "She balanced the checkbook, remembered appointments, kept track of all our social obligations. I was completely dependent on her for all the practical aspects of life." Kurt paused in his tire-changing efforts, struck by the profound loss that Walter was describing. The idea of losing someone so central to your existence seemed almost unbearable. Yet Walter was discussing it with remarkable composure. "That must be incredibly difficult," Kurt said, genuinely moved by Walter's situation. "It is," Walter admitted. "But you know what the strangest part is? Learning that you can survive things you never thought you could survive. 2 years ago, if someone had told me I would be managing a household by myself and visiting Eleanor every day while she slowly forgets who I am, I would have said it was impossible. Yet here I am, somehow getting through it day by day." The conversation continued. As Kurt worked on mounting the spare tire, Walter talked about the process of watching his wife's memory gradually fade, how she sometimes recognized him and sometimes didn't, and how he had learned to find meaning in small moments of connection, even when the larger relationship was no longer what it had been. "The doctors told me that eventually she won't recognize me at all," Walter said matter-of-factly. "But even now, when she doesn't remember my name or our history together, she still responds to kindness. She still smiles when I bring her flowers or read to her. That's something, isn't it?" Kurt was deeply affected by Walter's perspective on love, loss, and resilience. Here was someone facing one of life's most difficult challenges with grace and determination, finding ways to continue caring for someone even when that caring wasn't reciprocated or even recognized. "How do you do it?" Kurt asked. "How do you keep going when the person you love most doesn't even know who you are?" Walter was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously before responding. "I think it's because love isn't really about being recognized or appreciated," Walter said finally. "Love is about giving something of yourself to another person, regardless of what you get back. Eleanor may not remember our 48 years together, but I do. I remember for both of us." As Kurt finished tightening the lug nuts on the spare tire, he found himself thinking about his own relationships and his tendency to expect immediate reciprocation for his emotional investments. Walter's unconditional devotion to Eleanor, even in the face of her illness, challenged Kurt's understanding of what commitment really meant. "You must have some amazing memories from all those years together," Kurt observed.
"Oh, we do," Walter said, his face lighting up despite the difficult circumstances they had been discussing. Eleanor was a remarkable woman, still is, in her way. She taught second grade for 35 years, and had this incredible gift for connecting with children who were struggling.
Walter began sharing stories about Eleanor's teaching career and their life together, painting a picture of a partnership built on shared values, mutual respect, and genuine affection for each other's strengths and quirks. "Eleanor always said that teaching was like planting seeds," Walter continued. "You never know which lessons will take root, or how they'll grow, but you keep planting them anyway, hoping that something good will come of your efforts." Kurt was struck by the metaphor and its application to his own creative work. He had been so focused on immediate reactions to his music, reviews, sales figures, fan responses, that he had lost sight of the longer-term impact that art could have on people's lives. "Do you think she was right about that?" Kurt asked. "About planting seeds and not knowing how they'll grow?" "Absolutely," Walter replied without hesitation. Eleanor kept in touch with many of her former students over the years. Some of them would write to tell her how something she had taught them had influenced their lives in ways she never could have predicted. She always said those letters were worth more than any paycheck she ever received. As they finished cleaning up the tire-changing tools, Walter asked Kurt what he did for work. Kurt hesitated, unsure how to explain his career to someone who might not be familiar with alternative rock music. "I'm a musician," Kurt said simply. "I play in a band." "That's wonderful," Walter replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Music is such a gift. Eleanor and I always loved going to concerts and discovering new artists." "What kind of music do you play?" Kurt found himself in the unusual position of trying to describe Nirvana's music to someone who probably had no frame of reference for grunge or alternative rock. He settled for describing their music as loud and emotional, which made Walter chuckle. "All the best music is emotional," Walter said. "That's how you know it's connecting with people." Eleanor used to say that music was the universal language because it could communicate feelings that words couldn't express. The conversation had taken nearly an hour, and both men were becoming aware that they should probably wrap up their roadside encounter. But neither seemed eager to end what had become a surprisingly meaningful interaction. "I can't thank you enough for stopping to help me," Walter said, as they prepared to part ways. "You've been incredibly kind, and you've also been wonderful company. I haven't had such an interesting conversation in quite a while." Kurt realized that he could say the same thing. The encounter with Walter had lifted his spirits in a way that nothing else had managed to do in weeks. Talking to someone with such a positive outlook, despite facing genuine hardship, had reminded Kurt that his own problems, while real, were not insurmountable. "It was my pleasure," Kurt replied honestly. "I hope things go well with your wife. She sounds like she was an amazing teacher." "She was," Walter agreed, "and she still is, in her own way. She's teaching me about patience and acceptance and finding joy in small moments. Those are pretty valuable lessons, even if they're not the ones I expected to learn at this stage of my life." As they shook hands goodbye, Walter made a request that surprised Kurt. "Would you mind giving me your phone number?" Walter asked. "I'd like to call you sometime just to let you know how Eleanor is doing. It would mean a lot to me to have someone to share updates with." Kurt was touched by Walter's desire to maintain their connection and readily provided his contact information. In return, Walter wrote down his own number and invited Kurt to call if he ever wanted to talk. "Sometimes it helps to have someone outside your immediate circle to bounce ideas off of," Walter observed. "I have a feeling you might understand that." As Kurt drove home that night, he found himself replaying the conversation with Walter over and over in his mind. The elderly man's perspective on love, loss, and resilience had given Kurt a new framework for thinking about his own challenges and relationships. "That encounter with Walter was exactly what I needed," Kurt later told Courtney. Here was someone facing a genuinely tragic situation with grace and determination, and it made me realize that my problems weren't as overwhelming as I had been making them seem. Kurt also found himself thinking about Walter's description of Eleanor's approach to teaching, planting seeds without knowing how they would grow. This perspective helped Kurt reconnect with his original motivation for making music, which had been about expressing authentic emotions rather than achieving commercial success. Walter helped me remember why I started making music in the first place. Kurt reflected. It wasn't about fame or money or critical acclaim. It was about connecting with people who might be feeling the same things I was feeling. True to his word, Walter called Kurt about a week later to provide an update on Eleanor's condition and to thank him again for his help with the tire. This phone call began what would become a regular correspondence. Corresponds the two men over the following months. Walter would call every couple of weeks, Kurt remembered. He would tell me about his visits with Eleanor, and I would tell him about whatever was going on with the band. He became this unexpected source of wisdom and perspective in my life. Walter's influence on Kurt became apparent in several ways. Kurt began approaching his music with less anxiety about immediate reactions and more focus on authentic expression. He also started paying more attention to his relationships, inspired by Walter's example of unconditional love and commitment. After meeting Walter, Kurt seemed more present in his relationships, Courtney observed. He was less focused on his own problems and more interested in understanding other people's experiences and perspectives. Kurt also began volunteering at a local senior center, inspired by his conversations with Walter about the challenges facing elderly people who were living alone or dealing with health issues. Kurt started showing up at our center about once a month, recalled activity director Susan Martinez. He would help with meals, play guitar for the residents, and just spend time talking with people. He seemed genuinely interested in their stories and experiences. The relationship with Walter also influenced Tert's songwriting during this period. Several of the songs he worked on in late 1993 and early 1994 reflected themes of resilience, connection, and finding meaning in difficult circumstances. Ideas that had been central to his conversations with Walter. You could hear Walter's influence in some of Kurt's later work, observed music journalist Michael Azerrad. There was a maturity and depth to his writing that hadn't been there before, a sense of perspective that seemed to come from having meaningful conversations with someone from a different generation. Walter continued to provide updates about Eleanor's condition, and Kurt was moved by the elderly man's unwavering devotion to his wife. Even as her condition deteriorated, Walter's example of love without expectation of reciprocation challenged Kurt to think differently about his own approach to relationships. Walter showed me what real commitment looked like, Kurt told a close friend. He wasn't taking care of Eleanor because he expected anything back from her. He was doing it because he loved her, period. That's a pretty powerful example of what relationships can be at their best. In their final conversation, which took place just a few weeks before Kurt's death, Walter shared news that Eleanor had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Despite the sadness of the loss, Walter expressed gratitude for the years they had shared together and for the opportunity to care for her during her illness. Walter's response to Eleanor's death was remarkable, Kurt reflected. Instead of being bitter or angry, he focused on how fortunate he had been to love someone so deeply and to be able to express that love through his actions. Walter also used that final conversation to express his appreciation for Kurt's friendship and to encourage him to continue using his platform to connect with people who might be struggling. You have a gift for reaching people, Walter told Kurt. Don't underestimate the impact that your music and your presence can have on others. Sometimes a song or a conversation can plant seeds that grow in ways you never expect. These words proved to be prophetic, as Kurt's music would indeed continue to impact people long after his death, providing comfort and connection for countless individuals who felt isolated or misunderstood. After Kurt's death, Walter was devastated to learn that his young friend had taken his own life. The elderly man felt that he had somehow failed to provide the support and perspective that Kurt needed during his darkest moments. Walter blamed himself for not recognizing how much Kurt was struggling, recalled Walter's daughter, who had learned about her father's friendship with the musician after Kurt's death. He kept saying that he should have done more to help, should have seen the signs. However, those who knew Kurt during his final months recognized that his relationship with Walter had actually provided him with significant comfort and perspective during a difficult time. The elderly man's example of resilience and unconditional love had given Kurt a model for how to approach life's challenges with grace and determination. Kurt talked about Walter all the time in those final months, Dave Grohl remembered. Walter's perspective on life and relationships had a real impact on Kurt. I think that friendship gave Kurt some peace during a very troubled time. Walter lived for several more years after Kurt's death, often speaking to friends and family about his unlikely friendship with the young musician. He kept Kurt's phone number written in his address book until his own death, along with notes from their conversations. Dad never forgot about Kurt, Walter's daughter recalled. He would tell people about this kind young man, who had stopped to help him with a flat tire, and had become such an important friend. He was proud of their friendship, and sad about how Kurt's story ended. The roadside encounter between Kurt Cobain and Walter Chen illustrates the profound impact that unexpected human connections can have on our lives. What began as a simple act of kindness, helping a stranger change a tire, evolved into a meaningful relationship that influenced both men's perspectives on love, loss, and resilience. For Kurt, Walter's example of unconditional devotion and positive outlook despite facing genuine hardship provided a model for how to approach life's challenges with grace and determination. The elderly man's wisdom and perspective helped Kurt reconnect with his original motivations for making music and reminded him of the importance of authentic human connections. For Walter, Kurt's kindness and genuine interest in his story provided comfort during one of the most difficult periods of his life. The young musician's willingness to listen and learn from someone much older demonstrated that meaningful friendships can develop across generational lines when people are open to each other's experiences. The story of their friendship also highlights the ripple effects of simple acts of kindness. Kurt's decision to stop and help a stranger on a foggy November evening led to a relationship that influenced his music, his approach to relationships, and his understanding of what it means to live with purpose and compassion. Their connection serves as a reminder that we never know when we might encounter someone who will change our perspective or provide exactly the wisdom we need at a crucial moment in our lives. Sometimes the most important conversations happen not in planned settings but in unexpected moments, like on the side of a road on a foggy evening when one person chooses to help another. Kurt Cobain's encounter with Walter Chen demonstrates that authentic human connections can provide healing, perspective, and hope, even in our darkest moments. Their friendship, born from a simple act of roadside assistance, reminds us that kindness creates bonds that can transcend age, background, and circumstances, enriching both lives in the process. If this touching story of unexpected friendship moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who might need to hear about the power of human connection across generations. Have you ever had a meaningful conversation with a stranger that changed your perspective? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible stories about the moments of grace that can transform our lives.